Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the Buck Skills Show Online 2020. My name is Chris McNamara, founder and CEO of Pathway CTM. Delighted to be on this session this morning. We're looking at history, specifically the Battle of Britain, and we've got a fantastic guest in Kat from Historic England, a really fantastic brand, and they do some amazing things. So I'm going to hand over to Kat. Are you there?
Hi there, Chris. Morning. Good morning, everybody. Nice to kind of have you all here with us today. My name is Kat McHarg, and I'm the Archive Education Manager for Historic England. And today I'm going to talk to you about the Battle of Britain and aerial bombardment. And so kind of as we start, the Battle of Britain was a military campaign at the start of the Second World War, and it was basically the British against large-scale attacks on Britain by Nazi Germany's Air Force, the Luftwaffe. And so what we're going to look at today is what the role of aerial bombardment was in the Second World War, and how can archive collections and the Historic England Archive Collection help us to learn about the defence of Britain in the Second World War. So you may or may not have heard, there's a really famous quote by Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister at the time, and he said, "Never was so much owed by so many to so few." This is the classic quote for the Battle of Britain. But what we're going to look at today is, to what extent is the above statement actually true? That's going to be our inquiry question for the morning. So before we go into looking at the evidence, I just want you in your class to take a moment and think about, what sort of images does the phrase Battle of Britain make you think about? So take a moment, have a little discussion in class. Someone says Battle of Britain, what kinds of things might you think of?
Fantastic, Kat, and we'll just give that 30 seconds or so. And of course, if teachers are watching this recording, they can, of course, pause it if they do need more time. If you are doing it live, we're going to get going in a second. So what images does the phrase Battle of Britain make you think of? I've got a dogfight in the chat box here, Kat.
Oh, brilliant. Well, then if everybody's had a moment and started to put some ideas down amongst their class, I'll show you my images that I came up with for this question. And absolutely number one for mine was, it's a dogfight. Dozens of aeroplanes flying in the sky, swooping about, the brave pilots kind of manning the machine guns, defending the Britain, defending the skies, and of course the RAF pilots with their amazing moustaches, defending Britain and saving us all. This is the classic set of images that would make you think about the Battle of Britain. Absolutely, all of them absolutely true. These are all things that did happen in the Battle of Britain. However, these few pilots were supported by an extensive series of ground defences, which we can see on aerial photos from the 1940s. And handily, at the Historic England Archive, we actually have a collection of about 4 million aerial photographs. And so today we're going to look at some of those that come from the 1940s that might help us answer our inquiry question. So firstly, we're going to start with airfields. Now, this is Leicester Airfield, which is now Leicester Airport, and we can see the aeroplanes on the runways down there on top of it. But the thing about the Battle of Britain is, all aeroplanes need a place to land and they need a place to take off. So without these airfields all across Britain, the Battle of Britain could not have taken place. The airfields were an essential part of the defence. And at the start of the Second World War, there were about 250 airfields that had been built by the First World War. But during the Second World War, the number increased. Nearly 3 times as many airfields were built during the Second World War, to about 740 of them, all across the country. And actually, it's estimated that the amount of concrete that was needed to build these airfields was the equivalent amount of concrete that it would take to build a 9,000-mile long, 30-foot or 9-meter wide road all the way from London to Beijing. It was a phenomenal amount of work to do these airfields, not just to build them, man them, run them and staff them. If you think about how many workers and how many people were required just to lay that amount of concrete, it's a really, really incredible amount of effort and manpower that went into making those airfields that were essential for our Battle of Britain pilots to actually be able to take off into the skies.
Kat, I've just got a quick question, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
It was just from other students who I spoke to before this session, just saying Historic England, obviously the name's in your company, but why are Historic England presenting this presentation today? Like what links do you have to the war, I suppose, and Battle of Britain and history?
Our main link in this case is this amazing collection of aerial photos. It's completely unique. You know, no one else in the country has the same coverage and the same amount of aerial photos. But it's like primary source evidence. You know, these are photographers were flying in aeroplanes during the war while other pilots were flying and shooting and being shot at. These guys were flying with cameras mounted underneath their aeroplane, or cameras mounted on the side of their airplanes. There are two different types of air photos. We're looking at what's called an oblique aerial photograph here. So this is actually a guy leaning out of the aeroplane with a camera taking a picture. And some of the other photographs we have are what are called vertical air photos, where the camera was mounted underneath the aeroplane and took automatic shots, took photographs. So different kinds of shots, but really useful for us as historians because they provide this amazing sort of trove of evidence that we can delve into.
And I've just had a private question come through to me asking, were people's full-time jobs to go up and take photos of it and not have guns?
Absolutely, yes. There was an observation corps, that was their job during the war. And actually, even now, we have Damien, the Historic England, and his job to this day is to go out and lean out of an aeroplane and take aerial photographs. Nowadays, he's generally taking photographs of archaeology that you can see in crop marks or in fields across the countryside. In fact, looking out of the window today here, I've got a really good low winter sunlight, which is perfect for picking up things like medieval ridge and furrow and all sorts of different bits of archaeology. So cameras, archaeology, history, as soon as they invented the camera, it's been brilliant for historians and archaeologists to kind of learn more about the past.
That's amazing. And my final point then, and all these photos from the Battle of Britain are stored at Historic England, and that's your part in this?
Yes, yeah, basically we've got a state-of-the-art archive. Well, it's a giant fridge, really, if we're honest. We've got a giant fridge filled with all of these photographs, and it's our job to make them available to the public. Some of them are already digital and digitized, and other ones, as we go through looking at the collections, every time we look at a new photograph, we get it digitized and preserved so that it can be used digitally rather than people having to come into our archive in Swindon. We can make these things available online for people to use and enjoy at home or in school or wherever.
That's amazing. Thank you, Kat.
No worries. Okay, so we've done the airfields. The next type of site or next type of evidence that we're going to assess here is something called heavy anti-aircraft sites. And these show up really, really well on our aerial photos. They're one of my favorite ones to spot for, to be honest. Okay, so can you see these little 4 circles that I've just highlighted? Inside each one of those circles was basically a gun. It was mounted in the middle, and the gun could be rotated a full 360 degrees. So you could point it into the air and fire in any direction at the enemy planes that were coming at you from above. That was the whole point of these, was to try and shoot down the planes in the sky. And as well as the planes, as if you'll notice here, all of these other buildings. So we've got the 4 gun emplacements with the people inside shooting up into the sky, but we've also got all these other operational buildings, basically to allow the gun sites to work. So we've got ammunition stores, accommodation huts, all sorts of other things, so that basically this site, this gun site, could be permanently personed or manned. It could be permanently run throughout the war. So again, the numbers of people that we're talking about being involved in defending the skies above us, really quite large numbers of people. And that's what these photographs show us in the evidence. It isn't just one plane in the sky, it's all these defences on the ground as well. And so if we kind of have a look close up, this is another aerial photograph, but this is actually a much more close-up view of one of those 4 gun emplacements. And if you kind of look inside it, you can see there's little concrete, I'm going to call them concrete cupboards. Inside each one of these 4 things are little concrete cupboards. And that was so that you could store ammunition out of the way, but close at hand. It was really important that that space in the middle would have had the gun in it, which needed free movement. They didn't know what direction the planes were going to be coming from. They had to be able to swivel that gun and fire in an instant to try and knock them out of the sky. That was their job. But they needed to be constantly reloading with ammunition. The amount of rounds of ammunition it took to down a plane was really quite a lot. So they had to be well supplied and well sourced. So there's our 4 gun emplacements that you can see there, like on the other photo. And their job was basically to engage with the high-flying strategic bombers. Their job was to knock the bomber planes out of the sky before the bombers could drop their load onto the ground. So that's why these were a really important form of defense of the aerial bombardment during the Second World War. So that was a permanent site. They were made of concrete, as you could see, but there were also what were called mobile sites. And this was basically crews of men in trucks with guns who were then deployed to wherever they were needed across the country. So on this one here, we can see this is one of the mobile crews, and they're either setting up or taking down. I don't know, we'll have a look and see if we can decide in a minute when we look more closely at some of the detail. But I don't know if you can see that basically it forms the same sort of paw print for guns. There's still those same 4 guns laid out in the middle of the field, exactly the same arrangement as we saw for the permanent ones. But if you look really closely at the trucks at the edge of the field, they look kind of spooky and Halloweenish. They're actually completely covered with camouflage netting. So these are all the trucks that have arrived, bringing the troops and the guns, and then they're parked along the edge of the field and deliberately disguised with camouflage netting so that any enemy planes flying over or anybody spotting wouldn't be able to see them, wouldn't be able to give away the location of the gun site. And if we have a look closely here, you can just kind of see in the top right hand corner, there's a little person and he's actually got a gun over his shoulder. He's actually carrying, up here, he's carrying the barrel of the gun. And that's because these mobile sites were completely mobile. The guys arrived, got out of the trucks, and they built stuff from scratch. They actually had to assemble and put the guns together. And then when they were finished, take them apart again. So that's what we can see in this photograph happening here. The guns are being either put apart or put together or taken apart. And they were actually mostly associated with what was called Operation Diver. And this is a little bit, I'm going a little bit outside of the Battle of Britain here. They were used for the Battle of Britain, but they were actually became much more common as a tactic to deploy mobile units when the Germans switched to the V1 flying bomb, the first of what were known as the Nazis' retribution weapons. And so rather than shooting down planes, they were more likely to be deployed to shoot down these flying bombs, a different kind of target, but equally deadly and equally, important for the defense of Britain during the Second World War. Now, all of these guns and all of these aerial attacks, many of the air raids that happened on Britain, they happened at night. It's pitch black, complete darkness. So actually what was just important as the guns was what was called searchlight batteries. And these played a crucial role in helping the pilots. So we're going to look at one here from the aerial photograph. And if I told you that there were 3 searchlights usually placed together in an arrangement, I'll just give you a second to see if you can see what I'm going to highlight as where my 3 searchlights were placed on this particular photo, which shows an area on the edge of Liverpool.
3 searchlights. I think I've spotted them.
Yeah, you reckon you're in?
Yeah, let's just check to see if students get them as well in their classrooms. I think it's obvious, or maybe I'm a bit. Yeah, I hope I'm right.
Well, I think you'll probably find, Chris, that you are. Yep, we've got our 3 searchlights there in the middle. And can you see a little dot in the center of each of those circles? So there's a little bit in the middle that's like the little dot. And that's basically where the lamp was. And so a bit like the guns, the lamps could rotate 360 degrees on the ground, and they were shone right up into the air and used to try and spot the German planes that were flying over. And ideally what you wanted to do was get 2 of your lights to cross the beams bit Star Warsy, cross the beams of the two lights to so that either the anti-aircraft guns on the ground or other pilots, British pilots in the sky, could then use those to shoot down the plane. It was basically the most efficient way to get rid of them was to highlight them in the sky so that they were an easier target for us to shoot down. But again, you can see here, we've got all these little buildings. So it's not just the people operating the searchlights, it's the buildings at the side as well. And so basically they sort of locked onto the enemy. That was their job. It was like track and trace in the Second World War, find the aeroplanes, lock the lights onto them, and then help our people to shoot them down and destroy them. And interestingly, the searchlights were often, I'm going to say manned, they were often run by women. It wasn't just men who were involved in all of these ground defences and involved in protecting Britain. The ATS, or the Auxiliary Territorial Service, was the arm of the army that used women for these kinds of roles. And there was even an all-female 93rd Searchlight Regiment, where every person in the regiment working on the searchlights was a woman. So this was definitely a mixture of roles, and really saw everybody on the ground pulling together to make it as an effective system as possible for defending our skies from German attack. And then my final type of defense that I wanted to show you about this morning using the photos is, well, who would have thought balloons? If I said to you, don't worry, we're going to win the war, we've got balloons, you might think I'd slightly lost the plot for a minute. But actually, something called barrage balloons were really, really important in our defences in the Second World War. So I'm going to flick on, and if I just highlight here, that is a balloon up in the top left, and the bit on the ground is what was called the tether site. It's where the balloon had to be tied to the ground, otherwise the balloon would just float away. So to look at it close up, you've got the balloon, and then it was usually a ring on the ground where the cables for the balloon were tied down. And I often looked at these and I was like, a balloon tied to the ground, really? How on earth is that going to help defend our skies? But the balloons were held to the ground using these really, really heavy steel cables. And basically the idea was that any enemy aircraft that flew into those cables, well, it would just shred their wings. It would just destroy them, basically. And so that if they didn't see it in time, they would be damaged and the plane would be downed. And if they did see it in time and went, there's a barrage balloon, they had to fly up way, way higher. So by having to fly over the balloons, it meant that basically they were far less accurate in where they could drop their bombs or fire their guns. So the idea was, if we can't stop them with the cables, we'll make them go up much higher and make it far less accurate, and make it as difficult as possible for them to hit their targets on the ground. So balloons were actually a really useful line of defense. So having looked now at these different types of defenses and kind of comparing them to our slightly stereotypical images of the Battle of Britain that we used at the start, your task after this lesson is to assess the evidence that you've looked at, to think about all these different types of defense that I've presented, and hopefully maybe do a little bit more research. There's plenty out there on the internet, and I put some extra links in the teacher's notes section of the PowerPoint that your teacher's got, to see if you can find out any more research and try and address the question and the statement, to what extent is it true that so much was owed by so many to so few. So I'm gonna leave that as your challenge or your homework, if you like, to see what you can come to, what conclusions you can draw based on the evidence that you've just seen this morning. So does anyone have any questions about those photos before I move on to the careers bit?
I've got one question that's come through saying, do we know how many barrage balloons were in place at any one time?
Oh, that is a good question. And I don't have an exact answer, but I know that there were literally thousands of sites across the country. And so on any given night during the Second World War, all of these different ground defences would have been operational because you just didn't know when there was going to be a raid. You got advanced warnings, and so the lights may not have been switched on. It was actually a three-part system. So you would sort of get a warning from listening devices that could pick up the sounds of approaching enemy aircraft. Later, that was replaced by radar. And then once you got that warning, the searchlights came on, and then the ground attack with the guns. But there would always have been, that's what all those accommodation huts and all those extra buildings were there for. There would always have been somebody ready to man those particular defensive structures.
And Kat, thanks so much. I've just got a question. You know, the light beams that the women were often controlling. Was it quite a challenge to pick out the planes in the sky? Or were they always just searching for planes and maybe they'd pick one up? Or do you know how that worked?
No, it was quite a challenge, and they would get advanced warning as well if there had been sounds. If they managed to pick up with listening devices the sounds of enemy aircraft, the sounds of their engines approaching, they would then be given a rough direction as to which way they thought the planes were approaching from. So that would give them a starting point as to which direction to turn the lamps to look to try and find the planes. And then once you've found it, to then be able to lock on and track them, because obviously you're following a moving target. So even once you've found it, you've got to then stay on it. And then there's three of you there. So how many planes are attacking? If there's just one, all of you can concentrate on that one bomber plane. But if there's a whole fleet, you've got to communicate between the three of you, all of you working there together, to go, right, who are we going to pick out first? Which is the most dangerous target? Which is the most imminent threat? Who can we kind of knock out first? Or who can we help the pilots or the guns to pick out first?
Wow, no, that's great. Have you got some more slides, Kat? Because I have got some questions come through from schools, but we can leave them till the end.
Okay, well, I was going to move on now to, you wanted to know a bit about my career. So I was going to tell you a little bit about how I ended up here telling you about Second World War air defences. So this little drawing is actually my entire career mapped out in a little sketch map. So I'll just talk you through quickly how I ended up where I am today. So first things to say is I graduated in the year 2000 with a degree in archaeology and geography. But the only way that I got a place on the archaeology course was because I had a GCSE and an A-level in history. They were the entry requirements to be able to do archaeology at university. When I graduated, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I did see an advert at uni for a 6-month paid placement as an archaeologist with a company called Wessex Archaeology. So I went for it and applied and got the job. And then I became a digger, basically, and I worked all across the country on infrastructure sites like the Channel Tunnel rail link, the M6 toll road, A120 in Essex, housing estates all across the country. I basically dug across Britain. That was my job. Whether something was being built, you need an archaeologist. Then after doing that for a while, I ended up volunteering. Well, I kind of convinced that what I wanted to do was volunteer with the education and outreach team because they wanted someone to do a kids session on a Saturday morning. And from that, actually, I ended up working permanently in the education and outreach team, which meant that rather than just doing digging all across the country, I went into schools and took handling collections of archaeological objects in and explained to children in schools about what they were and how we found them. I worked on the website for the company. I wrote articles and I did blogs. I did adult training courses in how to be an archaeologist, and we did live blogs from the training courses every day. So putting that information online and making it available was an important part of it. And then I also worked with metal detectorists. So something called the Portable Antiquities scheme, which is where basically we want metal detectorists to contact archaeology companies if they think they found something, so that they send an archaeologist out to excavate it properly rather than just dig it up. And some metal detectorists have been really good at taking this on board. And when they think they found something big or, you know, particularly interesting, they call the archaeological companies. And the picture here is one example of where I was pulled out to a field in the middle of Wiltshire. And actually what I'm holding there is a Roman saucepan. And it's a Roman saucepan that was actually had the maker's mark stamped on it. Some chap called Publius Cipius Polybius made that in Italy somewhere around the end of the 1st century AD, sort of 80 to 100 AD. But basically, he was working somewhere near Pompeii. Well, Vesuvius went up in AD 79. The guy who made this saucepan would have seen the volcano go up and Pompeii be buried. I mean, it's just amazing. And that saucepan made by that guy has ended up in a field in Wiltshire. And in fact, it wasn't just one saucepan. It turned out to be 3 saucepans that were made in Rome, made in Italy, and 2 other sort of basically wine kettles, think mulled wine, that were made by Celtic Britons here in Britain. So it was a really interesting collection, and they're now both all available for people to see at the Salisbury Museum. It's called the Kingston Deverell Hoard because that was where the field was near. Members of the public can now go and see the things that the metal detectorists found and we excavated in that museum. So that was just me and one little hole in the ground. Sorry, Chris, you all right?
No, that's amazing. Yeah, do continue. We've only got 3 minutes left.
3 minutes left. Oh, blimey. Okay, right. Okay, so that was me, one hole. We're now at the stage where the next thing that we did was, rather than one person, the next big find was actually a bunch of cauldrons. Think Harry Potter cauldrons, witch's brew kind of thing. And this required a whole team of people, not just me, specialists from the British Museum, all working together really carefully. Really important that we recorded everything that we found. So we did detailed drawings and measurings. Attention to detail is really important. Basically, that is what the cauldrons that we found looked like at the end. So I then worked for English Heritage, where we did websites and online teaching resources for children and teachers coming to visit sites. And then I ended up at Historic England, using the aerial photographs like I've shown you today, making packs for schools and for teachers, training teachers in how to use aerial photographs and helping people get the most out of their local heritage across the country. So the skills that I've kind of had to have or had to use, all on the slide here, but you know, the ability to read a map and get yourself to a field in the middle of nowhere is really important. Technical drawing, attention to detail, written and verbal communications, things like Photoshop and HTML coding for all the website work, a whole range of different skills required to be able to do the different jobs. So, right, Chris, any other questions at the end there?
It's so interesting. I've got some questions from Chiltern Hills Academy. Well done, guys. How would a GCSE in history help me with this job?
Basically, if I hadn't done GCSE history, to be able to go and do A-level history, I would never have been allowed to go to university and do archaeology, and I wouldn't have got to do all this brilliant stuff. So totally glad I chose GCSE history.
And just for those who are wondering, archaeology, just in layman's terms, so I could tell my friends about it, what exactly am I doing in that job?
Okay, so history is written stuff, archaeology is not written stuff. So it's basically what can we find out by digging up evidence from the past and being able to interpret it and work out what we can tell about people's lives in the past from the stuff that they left behind.
That's brilliant, hence you being the digger, right?
Yeah, that's the one.
Oh, that's really interesting, thank you. And what do you enjoy most about your job and why? That's from the Chiltern Hills Academy as well.
What I enjoy most about my job now is definitely the fact that lots of the aerial photos that I'm looking at, because they're not already digital, no one's seen them before. No one's seen them recently. So by me getting them out and putting them in a pack to give to a school means that actually, rather than just being sat in our big archive in Swindon, people are actually able to see them and find out stuff from them and use them. So I think that's a really good thing to be able to do.
Fantastic. And final question before we end the lesson. You did archaeology at university. Do you have to study history at university to do these types of jobs?
No, there are other ways. There are more apprenticeships and sort of learning on the job ways of getting into. Historic England runs an apprenticeship scheme, and other archaeological companies are now running it. They're offering it as an official apprenticeship scheme. It's being piloted right now and will be available, you know, in the future as an apprenticeship that you can take. So you could choose to go in via an apprenticeship rather than via a degree route.
So Kat, it's been an amazing lesson. Thank you so much. Do look at the skills and on the screen there, students. Think about any of those skills, things that you're maybe passionate about or good about, things that you're good at. Kat, thanks so much for your time today. Any final words from you?
Well, I was just going to say, if they want to put their skills to the test, we've got an online activity where you can have a go and see if you're paying attention to my slides about aerial photographs, and there's some little online quizzes for you to go and do after the session and see how you get on with them.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kat, and good luck with the task there, students, and hopefully this has really helped your interest in history. Thank you, Kat.
Thank you.